Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back into the podcast. Yet another episode of Crushing Fantasy Football. I am Bryce Loggery, your host of the show. Guys, today I am going to be talking to you guys about how to crush rounds 3, 4, and 5 of your draft in the 2022 fantasy football season. And I'm going to start with my most important part of the third round by far, and that is to make sure that you draft a second stud running back or a third stud running back for your team with your third round pick. Now, the running back position this year is very scarce, mainly due to all the split backfields and the way that teams construct their backfields now. There's just not as many true three-down backs as there used to be, so that creates extreme scarcity at the running back position, and stud running backs are even more valuable now than they have been in the 2021 season and in seasons past because there's just less stud running backs. Pretty much after the third round, there's not a whole lot of great running backs left, so make sure that your third round pick involves either your second stud running back or your third stud running back for your fantasy football team. And even if there's a great pass catcher staring at you in the face, if you've gone running back, wide receiver to start the draft, your third round pick needs to be a running back. Otherwise, you're leaving yourself in a very bad position. So the third round is pretty simple, guys. Make sure that you load up on the running back position because after this round, there's not a whole lot of great running backs left. And also make sure that at this point in the draft, every player that you need to be drafting, whether that be a running back, receiver, tight end, they need to be a player that fits the high ceiling, high floor combination profile. If they only have a high ceiling, but they come at a risk, they have no business being drafted in the third round because there are still plenty of players that go at this point in the draft and even later into the draft that have the combination of the floor and the ceiling. So it's too early in the draft to start drafting players that come at a high risk. If you think that a player is extremely injury prone or might not get the volume that everyone else is expecting, if you have any reason to believe that a player comes at a high risk, do not draft them in the third round despite the ceiling. Moving on to the fourth round, this is significantly more complicated than the third round. This is when things start to get a little bit tricky. And for this reason, you need to be able to adjust on the fly at this point in the draft. And a big reason for this is because people haven't researched these rounds. They researched the first round really hard. They researched the second and third round not as hard as they researched the first round because that's all everyone is obsessed with every year for whatever reason. But when it comes to the fourth round, players start to draft strictly based on ADP, or in a lot of cases, they're really just starting to guess and draft players that they know by name and players that are kind of their favorite players. And they start to use all kinds of really weird logic when it comes to their drafting in the fourth round or later because they just haven't dug deep enough to figure out who an actual good pick is at this point in the draft. So you need to be able to adjust because certain players are going to start to come off the board at this point in the draft that are just completely unpredictable, players that you did not think were going to get drafted because you go into the draft every year with a certain plan in place, right? And you think that certain players are going to be available at X draft position and you know who the value picks are and everything like that, and you know who you're going to draft. And then all of a sudden somebody reaches for the stud player that you wanted to get mainly because they were just guessing, and the draft starts to become kind of a shit show. So you want to be able to adjust on the fly, and just because the player that you planned on taking in the fourth round that you thought was a guarantee to be there in the fourth round goes off the board doesn't mean that that is an excuse for you to become one of those players that starts guessing. You need to still have a plan in place for the next player and the next player that you're going to take in the fourth round if the player that you're expecting to draft goes off the board for whatever reason, because people kind of start to guess at these rounds. Don't be that guy. Next is you need to, if you've taken all three running backs, it's probably a good time to go ahead and draft a pass catcher. I wouldn't recommend drafting a fourth running back here, mainly because all of the stud running backs are going to be off the board at this point, most likely anyway. And if you've gone running back, you really need to start drafting pass catchers at this point. There's still tons of incredible pass catchers on the board at this point. So go ahead and draft a great wide receiver. If you've gone running back, wide receiver, it's okay to go ahead and draft your second wide receiver. Or if you want to add depth at your running back position, if you've already drafted a wide receiver in the third round or the second round, it's okay to do this as well. So make sure that after your first 4 picks, you either have 3 stud running backs and a stud wide receiver or 2 stud running backs and 2 stud wide receivers. Absolutely in no way, shape, and form should you have 3 pass catchers and only 1 running back at this point. Next is you want to avoid the quarterback trap, guys. Don't start drafting quarterbacks at this point in the draft. A big reason for this is because what I talked about when I was talking about the first part of the fourth round draft strategy. People just start to take players that they like, guys like, Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson at this point in the draft because they just don't know who else to draft. And quarterbacks are the most well-known players in the NFL. So people see that player that's just, really popular as far as their overall fanhood in the NFL, and tons of players, tend to start gravitating towards quarterbacks at this point just because they look really juicy. But Drafting a quarterback in the 4th round is a huge mistake in fantasy football. If you watched my video that I made last week about how to draft an elite fantasy team in 2022, I say that you should wait for the 9th round to start drafting quarterbacks. Drafting quarterbacks in the 4th round is way too early to start drafting quarterbacks, so you want to avoid this mistake at all costs. Do not reach for a quarterback in the 4th round. Next, going on to the 5th round, is it's okay in the 5th round to start looking for some upside players. If you've followed the model that we've put in place so far, which is drafting players that only fit the high floor, high ceiling combination, and made sure to avoid all the high risk players that go in the super early rounds, guys like, Dalvin Cook, Tyreek Hill. If you've made sure to avoid these players and you follow the model that we put in place so far, it's okay to start taking some players that have a massively high ceiling and come at a little bit of a risk. There are a ton of them at this point in the draft. We've got Courtland Sutton, Saquon Barkley. Who else do we got here? DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, Eli Mitchell, A.J. Dillon. There are tons of players at this point in the draft that have a massively high ceiling and could be huge league-winning players in the 2022 season, but they also come as a little bit of a risk. And since we've drafted low-risk players in all of the first 4 rounds, we now have the luxury of getting to take players that come at a little bit of a risk but have a massively high ceiling. And if we've drafted risky players in the earlier rounds, we can't do this, and we have to draft for a safe floor at this point, which is not something we want to do, because some of the best players that go in the 5th round are the players that are risky but have a massively high ceiling. We want to have a chance at taking Saquon, DeAndre Hopkins, A.J. Dillon, guys like this that can be league-winning players. And the fact of the matter is, since it's the 5th round and not the 1st round, if this pick busts, it's not as much of a hit to your fantasy team as if your 1st round pick busts. Okay, so that's why we took the low-risk players in the first 4 rounds. So we have the luxury of taking the high-ceiling players in the 5th round or later. Okay, and another huge part, and this is something that I guess might sound kind of cheesy, but a huge part of the draft in the 5th round is to just not get discouraged. Look, you go into your draft every year with a certain plan in place, and things kind of just happen throughout the draft that are a little bit unexpected because, that player that you thought you wanted to get and you thought was going to break your fantasy team, you might have missed out on. Like, you might have been dead set on getting Ja'Marr Chase, but some douchebag decided to draft him with the 2nd overall pick. And since you had the 5th overall pick, you missed out on Ja'Marr Chase, who you really wanted to draft, right? It's okay if this happens. And I want to encourage everyone to not just check out of the draft just because it hasn't gone exactly the way you wanted it to go so far. There's 16 rounds to the draft for a reason. Every single round of the draft makes a difference and is very important to your fantasy team. So just because the draft hasn't gone exactly according to plan so far doesn't mean that you should dip out. Continue to draft well. Don't put your team on auto draft. Don't start making lazy picks. Continue to make the best draft pick possible at every possible position, and you're giving yourself a very good chance to win your league. All right, guys. These are my strategies for rounds 3, 4, and 5. I appreciate you tuning into the video, and I will catch you later.